All right, welcome back. Today we are talking about child labor laws and the ethics of child labor. If you want to take it, you want to give the background on child labor?
Yeah, absolutely. So we need to we'll define child labor according to the definition set forth by the International Labor Organization, and it is basically defined as the work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to physical and mental development, which is a pretty broad definition.
I was
It's
just going to say the first major problem I see with that definition is how they're defining childhood. That's going to be very important there.
Absolutely, and even the parts of depriving their potential and dignity, and also it's important to note, and this will come into play later, that this definition is coming from a Western perspective and Western culture, and childhood, as you alluded to, is defined differently based on cultural norms and standards.
Certainly.
So the definition is fluid, and like I said, it's and not just Western. Let me rephrase that to be more developed, because child labor is in it's more of an economy centric action. So we really need to compare developed economies, regardless of culture, versus undeveloped economies.
So what you're saying, I think what you're saying here is that even in Western civilization, the idea of what child labor is and its importance and its role and how to regulate it is going to be dependent perhaps on the development level of the individual region or perhaps the historic time frame.
That is correct.
Okay, all right. So why don't you set us up for that historic time frame?
So the most relevant history we can look at for child labor laws really need to be in the West, specifically England and the United States, as the two economies that went through a massive industrial revolution, and most of Western Europe, at least, is now an advanced economy. But specifically, England and the United States started out in that industrialized state and are now at a more what we would consider modern economy. And child labor laws in England really started in the mid 18th century, so we're looking at around 1750. And what's interesting about that is, like I said, it started in the Industrial Revolution, but there were two types. They classified two different types of child labor: what was considered free labor and what was considered parish apprentice children. And the free labor is what we would saw as children living at home and would work during the day, and the wages were negotiated by the parents and what the parents would find acceptable for their children. And there's no evidence that exists that these children were working in conditions unacceptable to their parents.
And to
And
clarify that, when you're talking about that kind of a system, you're talking about these children are living at home and they're working during the day outside of the home. They're not working on a homestead. Is that correct?
that is correct.
Okay.
Although rural England, you did see, just like anywhere in the world, and the more rural you get, the more child labor would be focused on, your homestead work or agriculture. So, but this is important because industrialization gave parents more options to gain income. And but the second set of child labor in England was the parish apprentice children, excuse me. And these were essentially wards of the state. So they were orphans or children of parents who were unable to care for them. These children were often put to work after the laws were relaxed, with an overflow of parish children. So basically, there were no parents. These were wards of the state. No parents to negotiate wages. No parents to keep them or ensure safe working conditions. What had happened is the government had been so overrun with orphan children that they didn't know what to do with them. So they just put them to work, and there was little incentive for them to ensure the safety of the children.
And why was it that in that time period there were so many orphans?
It's not necessarily that there was more than usual. It's the problem is that because you had the industrialization, people were moving to the city, and I mean, that's a good question. As the cityscape grew, there were the family as a unit was disrupted massively, and so you had opportunities for parents to basically abandon their children in favor of whatever they would do in the industrialized economy.
So,
So it's. Oh, I'm sorry. Go
yeah,
ahead.
I was going to say so in other words, without the homestead, without the conventional agricultural background where they need the children for labor, oftentimes they're not needing the they don't need that extra labor, so a child could be essentially an unwanted child. If you have an extra child on a farm, it's more work, it's more as another laborer that can do tasks. But in an industrial setting, it does not necessarily equal that same output.
That's correct. And in a homestead situation, there's always something that the child can do to bring value to the family. Whereas in an industrialized setting, living in a city, one needs to, during this time period at least, one needs to consistently work to purchase things that were traditionally either made or raised or grew on the farm. But what's interesting about these two different types of child labor is that the first child labor laws in England were put into place specifically for the parish apprentice children. So the government creates a problem of children in unsafe working conditions, and they pass laws specifically to fix the problem. Very little complaints, if any, were about free labor children.
But
So
were the laws specific to the parish apprentice children, or were they broad laws applying to all children?
they were broad laws. They were
Ah,
broad laws with the citing of the parish children as the motivation, but they applied to everybody. And like I'll talk about a little bit with the history of child labor in the United States, what's important to note is that the laws that were passed were very weak in comparison to today's standards. I mean, you're talking laws that said that children 14 and under can work no more than 6 days a week, and couldn't work more than 10 hours a day. I mean, these are very weak laws, and that's important. That'll be important later, but these aren't strict sort of laws like we have today.
okay.
So the child labor laws in the United States were pretty much modeled after the laws in England. And the laws in the United States were at the state level and generally handled at the state level until 1938. And the number of states that passed laws increased over time. For example, in 1880, the number of states prohibiting people younger than 14 from employment in manufacturing was zero. By 1890, that number grew to 3, 1900, 12, and then 32 states in 1910. But by 1899, 44 states had some sort of laws regarding child labor. So it really didn't start until around 1850. The laws, although Massachusetts had one in, I believe, 1838, somewhere around there. But generally, the late 1800s is when you saw the rise in child labor laws. But that correlates with the rise in the progressive movement in the United States, which capitulates in the FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, New Deal era.
You mean
So,
it? That's where it is. The word escapes me. Not capitulates. Capitulates means to surrender.
oh, right, right.
It culminates.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. So, child labor laws at the federal level really didn't. It really wasn't much. People have this idea that it was handled at the federal level, but it really wasn't. The first attempt at it was in 1916, the Keating-Owen Act and it banned products made by children under 14 from being sold over state borders. The Supreme Court rightly struck it down. I mean, it was passed in the name of interstate commerce, but the Supreme Court at the time was pro, market and struck it down. 1924, the Senate passed a constitutional amendment banning child labor, but you know, it's not just the Senate that has to pass a constitutional amendment. The states need to ratify it, which it never gained enough support. And there's various reasons for that. But the National Recovery Act of 1933 banned child labor under 16 in factories and mining, and that was probably the most sweeping child labor law in the country
So I'm
by that
noticing
time.
a trend here that we go from the late 19th century. You have this exponential growth factor in the support for child labor laws in the states, and then into the 30s, we see the federal government taking control of those. Am I following that correctly?
Yes, the beginning of the 20th century saw the peak of the progressive movement. And actually, unfortunately, that they never came down from that peak. But the peak of the progressive movement, especially with Teddy Roosevelt, and so, but the National Recovery Act, of course, was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1935. But what's important about that is that act threw around 150,000 children out of work. And of course, children were defining as under 18. So a lot of these were teenagers. They're not 4 and 5 year olds. But in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, and that was never struck down. By that time, the Supreme Court had shifted progressive itself and was no longer striking down any anti-market laws that were passed.
I'm picking up on something. I'd just like to interject quickly here. As far as my own academic studies and my field, I do discuss quite often the changes in the family over time and through the Industrial Revolution. We see how the family size decreases due to the going away from the agricultural homesteading, the more quote-unquote natural settings where you need more children to do that labor. Again, part of that being because if you're living in a city, you don't need per se that extra labor. You can afford to abandon children if you so choose. But also, if you're going into situations, it would seem, where children can actually earn money, not to make it sound like you're having children for profit motive, but if the children can actually earn money, say in their early teens, these kinds of laws are actually going to have a hindrance effect or a mitigating effect on the birth rate, because people are going to be disincentivized to have children if those children cannot help to produce funds for the family, because the children are essentially going to be dead weight as far as economics. So especially if you're talking about hard economic times, it would seem that people would then have less children voluntarily, specifically to avoid that burden.
Well, I think that's right. And the beginning of the 20th century, sort of mid 20th century, you do see changes in the sizes of family. But that's, it's interesting you mentioned children for profit, but that's exactly what we have today with the welfare state. So, people have children as a resource mechanism. And that's kind of like what it was in the beginning of human civilization, where the more children you had, the more people to bring you sources of, either income or, more specifically, just resources.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it as well. We like to think of oftentimes family interactions as being completely removed from economic systems, but the reality is that while we do, of course, have emotional, intellectual, and personal bonds with people in our family, hopefully we care about them. We want to lift them up to be the best they can be, to self-actualize themselves. But at the same time, there are economic variables that play a role in that. And when you get into sort of the perhaps less reputable side of the spectrum of human society. We see people who do, uh, as they say, just pop them out. It's a way of accruing money, and I've seen this firsthand, where people are essentially having children as a means of collecting welfare. So it is interesting how we can turn that that argument completely around and still reach that same point where you see children being used as a means of income, although often people don't seem to equate that with the same kind of abuse and neglect as they do as a child working in a factory for some reason.
Well, and of course, this is a different subject for a different day. But
Absolutely. I was
I
going to
will
say
just,
I
I
am
will
digressing.
just, I will just. Um, it is a different subject, but of course, I will just touch on the fact that before, right now, children are a means of an income because the state has essentially replaced fatherhood for many children. But that again, that's a that's a different discussion.
Right, and I would agree with that statement completely. But before I derail the topic, why don't you continue where you left off?
Well, and that's pretty much it about the history, at least in the U.S. So like I said, by 1938, the child labor laws that we see today, more or less, it had become a federal issue by that point somehow, and the laws have been on the books pretty much ever since. And so when people think of child labor, sort of a shifting to more modern times for this discussion. When people think of child labor, they often think of, sweatshops or, 5-year-olds working in just hot, terrible factories. And oftentimes that is the case. But I'm going to argue that as distasteful as child labor is, it is necessary in developing economies. And so advanced economies today, we look at many Western economies begin with industrialization. And the U.S. and Britain saw their industrialization hundreds of years ago, but there are many parts of the world that are still going through that process. To a lesser extent, China, but especially Cambodia, Burma, Singapore, a lot of Asian countries. We don't really see this so much with the Middle East, but they're not industrialized at all. So what's important about this is that proponents of child labor laws today basically want to impose harsher standards for child labor than we actually had during our as in the United States and Britain's Industrial Revolution. And the question I pose is, does that hurt the country's chance at development? And I would argue it does, because factories need workers and families need income. And it seems like a perfect match. And if children were not allowed to work like they are today during the British and U.S. Industrial Revolution, it's arguable that we would not have the advanced economy we do today. So, according to the World Bank, see, these are statistics from the World Bank, countries with annual income less than $1,000 a year actually have more child labor than countries with annual income $11,000 or more. It's actually
You mean the per capita income?
yes. So countries with per capita income of $11,000 or more see a significant drop in child labor rates. And basically, the better the economy, the less child labor is needed. Because as families get more wealthy and accumulate more assets and income, the less they need children to work. I mean, no parents want their children to work. No parents wake up.
Well, I don't know. I think there's a few out there.
Well, I mean, in context, I mean, parents want their children to get an education and do what they want during their childhood. They don't want to see their 7-year-old go off to, a camp or work in a factory, of course. So as families become more wealthy, the children work less, and the problem is banning child labor does not increase a family's wealth. So
And you're making this argument specifically from the perspective of a developing nation, right? We're not talking about the developed world now.
that's right. We're specifically talking about, think of a family in, say, Cambodia. There's a New York Times piece about a 17-year-old girl in Cambodia, and this was in 2004. She made 75 cents a day, and what she would do is, like a lot of people in Cambodia would do, is just walk through trash heaps and, pick up cans and bags and whatever she could do to sell to make money. And she was interviewed regarding sweatshops in Cambodia, basically factories, and she said that she would love to work in a sweatshop because she would be able to earn up to $2 a day. And the reason why she can't work there is because Cambodia has child labor laws that prevent her from working at that factory. So she wouldn't be allowed to work there until she was 18.
Now, the counter argument to that, though, of course, is going to be that the child in that kind of a situation has been sort of tricked into wanting to be a part of the capitalist system so that they can be grateful for their exploitation. With somebody making that kind of an argument, how might you respond in support of your own argument for the elimination of child labor laws, as far as that would be?
Well, I have to laugh because, I, these are the people who would argue that are not people who are making 75 cents a day. I'm trying to look at things from the perspective of this girl. It's easy for me to sit there and say that she's being tricked and how could anybody possibly want to? Well, what's the alternative? Continue to work to find money in a trash heap, or work in a factory. At least the factories are somewhat safer, and that's actually proven that the industrialized the International Labor Organization, they state that manufacturing jobs are one of the safest jobs children can do in these developed countries. What's much more dangerous are agricultural jobs, one of the most dangerous jobs you can possibly think of. Children get sick, children get hurt, children die at a much higher rate in agricultural and mining jobs and construction jobs. So what is I would say to these people, well, what's their alternative? If you think that they're being tricked into some capitalist scheme, that's fine, but what would you say she should do otherwise? Continue to make 75 cents a day? It's kind of pretentious and arrogant to think that somebody who, makes a nice living in a developed Western economy thinks that a girl who could improve her life, you know what I'm saying? I don't get that argument.
Yeah, I think that without we could go really far down the rabbit hole with this one, but I think that the counter argument would probably involve something having to do with the elimination of the free market and state heavily regulated state labor. But I don't want to go down that road because that's a big topic.
Well, sure, and then they can turn into the Soviet Union, and their economy can collapse too. What, it's like, if one feels that an industrialized economy is, exploitation, are they typing this on their computer that was made from industrialization? You're right. It is a rabbit hole. We should.
I have actually a side note to this, the idea of child labor, and that is the idea of, by eliminating child labor, even in the developed world, I'll take it outside of your context and just speak broadly. The elimination of child labor may actually be a detriment to the child, not just the family. And I'm not speaking in the sense of, I'm not speaking financially. I mean, as far as work ethic and an appreciation for basic economics and the value of hard work. Um, I think that there's an epidemic today, especially almost exclusively in the West, of children who have absolutely no concept of what labor is, and they seem to, as they grow into quote unquote adulthood, which I argue isn't truly adulthood, they're just older children, they seem to lack the basic skills, and the basic skills, the very basic skills, not being specific workplace skills, but rather the skill of knowing that you must work to reap the benefits of your work. We have a system under which there's no child labor, and then into teenage years, oftentimes they get like 16, you get a little part-time job or something like that. But for the most part, your hand is very firmly held right through your early 20s. And at the end there, the society just kind of dumps you off the end of the conveyor belt and expects you to survive in a very competitive market. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that I think it's great for children to be working in factories. I think it would be wonderful to see more children working with their families. I think that that creates a great community bond. It creates a foundation for the family. You can pass down trade skills to your children very well. But even outside of that more ideal situation, what do you think about the idea that child labor laws could actually just be inherently detrimental to the work ethic, to the future, the economic future of the child?
I think there's validity to that. I mean, what most people say when they think of child labor is they think that children should be in school rather than working. And it depends on, there's no one size fits all. So for some children, being in school might be a better option. It depends on what their preferences are and what they want to learn. But for a lot of children, learning a skill is a more appropriate option. So,
And certainly, I think that it's going to be very context dependent as well. Of course, I mean everything is, but if you look at, for instance, the basic education that was given to children in the late 19th century, literacy, mathematics, basics, just basic stuff, before the public school system really ramped up. And you compare the intelligence of the average person brought up in that system who would be doing a lot of farm work, or maybe they would have like some child labor before the laws were enacted, but they're working in some way, and they're combined with basic literacy, basic education, and you compare those people and their character to what we have now, where childhood is supposedly sacred, but it's a perpetual system by which children are abused in, because they are fed into a system of supposed education system that really doesn't give them anything that's useful. They're oftentimes raised by the media. Their family isn't present in their lives. And it seems like in that context, a little bit of work might not be a bad idea.
right. Going to school is a full-time job, basically. I mean, you get a couple of months off, if that, but it's essentially a full-time job. So let's just say put elementary school aside, let's say from middle school onward, child is in school for 10,000 hours, and based on the statistics right now in the United States, people who graduate high school and they go out into the workforce, assuming no further training, if they can find a job, they can only make a minimum wage. So for 10,000 hours of schooling, they're barely worth minimum age to businesses. So imagine if a child just, let's say, goes to an elementary school and then Rather than go on to sixth grade, they work at a job that appeals to them. Maybe they work in a bookstore, maybe they work, I don't, maybe they do work at a factory, and maybe they just sweep the floor. I don't know. But the job skills that they gain during that time would lead them to higher earning potential at the same age as somebody going through school. Now, of course, if somebody decides to go through school and then they go on to go to college and they go to become a doctor. Well, obviously that person's earning potential will be higher than somebody who doesn't do that. But it's all relative. So it's, if a child is, the skills that a child could learn doing basic tasks at 10 or 11 years old are more valuable. Clearly, they're more valuable considering, like I said, that kids graduate high school and can barely earn minimum wage.
Okay. So, did you have anything else to say about generally the background or your position that we didn't get to?
No, I mean just to summarize, I mean people need to, when they think of child labor, they need to look at it from the context of the economy, and to basically to say that children in Cambodia or Burma, for example, shouldn't work. There should be some law to prevent them, or companies should be boycotted, heaven forbid, for utilizing child labor. All you're doing is not only harming the future earning potential of that child and future generations, but you're harming that child. You could potentially be harming that child physically. So, in just as a quick example, in 1994, I believe it was, there was a bill introduced in the United States called the Harkin bill, named after its sponsor. And what it would what the bill would do was not allow, basically, to boycott companies who used children under 14 to manufacture clothes, and it was kind of aimed at Walmart at the time. And the bill never actually became law, but the threat of the bill actually led to hundreds, over 100,000 people or kids in, I forget what it was, Cambodia, I believe. These kids were fired from their jobs, and the UN followed, and these nonprofit organizations and non-governmental organizations followed up with those children to find out what happened to them. And a lot of them went into child sex. They went into prostitution because they had no other option.
Wow, yeah.
It's, I mean, talk to soldiers who've been in Afghanistan and ask them what child labor was like. There's 5-year-olds running around the street offering to wash your car for you because they need money, and there's no school. There's no home life where these kids can be at home enjoying. There's nothing like that. And this is what the United States was. This is what Britain was hundreds of years ago. So to deny them the chance that in maybe 100 or 2 years that they can get where we are now, I find it monstrous.
Okay, that does help to better explain your position there. So essentially, when you go back to the example of the trash collecting child, essentially she's being doomed to that job because the regulation is keeping her out of a market resource which she could utilize. She could work at the factory. She has the skills to be able to work at that factory. It's actually safer than what she's doing now, but the regulation says you can't work at that factory, so she's essentially doomed to being a trash collector until X age.
Yes.
And the thing that I find very interesting about this is that the law, and this is another example where we see the law is not conforming to what it's actually supposed to be doing. The law is, for the sake of argument, supposedly, idealistically, it is supposed to be keeping children out of dangerous working conditions. But in reality, it's at some times, at least, we can't say for all examples. I'm sure we could have other counter examples, but in this situation, it is keeping the child out of a safe environment or a safer environment. And the ironic thing here is that these children are working. It's not like they're not working. They're working. They're just working in the black market. They're not supposed to be working, but they're collecting trash, or they're offering to wash cars, or God forbid they're in the sex trade. They are working to obtain resources illegally because at the end of the day, they need to eat.
Well, that's right. And generally, the people who despise this position that I'm taking are people on the left. And what they say, I think when you said that children working in the black market is exactly correct, because, I mean, think about it like this, and this is what I tell people on the left who abhor my position, is they argue that drugs should be legalized because it takes them out of the black market. It makes them, more safe. There's more regulation with it. Well, the same thing can be applied to anything. I mean, if something is in the black market, then it's not just from the standpoint of government that it's not regulated, but it's not even regulated by standard market forces. It's put underground. You don't know what's going on. You don't know how or why it's going on. So to put child labor in from the standpoint of into the black market, you lose control over what's going on.
That's a very interesting way to put it as well when you say that it kind of takes it out of thought, out of social thought. So because we don't see, this is, well, if you go to Colorado, it's different, but I was going to say for the most part in the United States, you don't see marijuana dispensaries or, just take a drug that's illegal everywhere, like cocaine or something like that. You don't see that. You don't see it like you see smoke shops, you see alcohol shops. So it's out of sight, out of mind. People kind of are stunned then when they find out that there's rampant cocaine use in their community. The same thing could be applied to any black market system or market, sub-market within the market in regard to people are unaware of it. And if they're unaware of it, they may be unaware of all the problems. So perhaps they enact this law to regulate child labor, and then everyone feels good about themselves. They say, look, we've gotten rid of child labor, and the government comes out with a statistic, and they say we have 0 children working under this age. It's been success. But what they don't see is all the children searching for trash, all the children that are washing cars for a quarter or a dime or something, the children that are in the sex trade, and that you would argue in this example. So if you could see all of that, you would see that children being kind of encouraged to go into the sex trade through regulation is obviously far worse than having the children work in the factories. So I think that that's a very interesting perspective just on the black market itself, to be able to view it as just because it's a black market does not mean it does not exist. It's very much there.
Well, that's right. And not just from the jobs themselves cannot be monitored for safety, but if somebody is rooting through trash, or a 5-year-old is running around the streets trying to wash people's cars, I mean, it's not just sometimes these kids aren't choosing to go into the sex trade. They're literally kidnapped and put in the sex trade because they do not have, I mean, say what you want about the working conditions, but nobody's going to force their way into a factory and drag a child away from their machine to kidnap them. I mean, it's a safe environment from that standpoint. And also, there's actually Nike. Not a lot of people know this. I mean, people pick on Nike because, 5-year-olds make their shoes or whatever they say, but Nike in these developing countries provides things like free health care and free meals during work hours to their workers. So, if they get hurt at work, it's not like the company says, well, you're on your own. They take care of the person. Whereas if they're out on the streets and they get hurt, they are on their own, unless some charitable person comes by but that's few and far between.
Interesting. I actually did not know that about Nike. Um, One thing that I find is reoccurring when I talk about industrialization, if I'm giving lectures or if I'm discussing it with people that aren't quite as well informed on the topic, is that people tend to be very, especially when I'm discussing globalization, people tend to be very triggered, I guess you'd say, by sweatshop conditions, um, by obviously standards of living that are far below what we're used to here. But what I try to explain is not whatever opinion you have of sweatshops is fine as long as it's an informed opinion. But a lot of people don't realize that it wasn't too long ago when Western civilization had similar but arguably worse working conditions for most laborers. So a lot of the world is going through the process of industrialization that the West went through earlier, and it just seems to be that because we're a little bit further down that road, when we look and we see other nations around us in these conditions that we would not accept, we tend to have a emotional reaction as to wanting to stop it. But for the mixed bag that industrialization is in the developing world, there are a lot of people that claim that their lives are being benefited from it and they're earning more than they would have if they had stayed in less developed areas.
Right, and it is an understandable emotional reaction to it. I mean, I have that reaction too, but at the same time, it doesn't cloud my judgment of what is. I don't know what is best for these kids in these countries. I mean, only they know what's best for them. They can make those choices, or their parents if they're still younger. But to for me, sitting in my developed economy, in my air conditioned room talking to you on a computer, it's arrogant for me to say that these people shouldn't have a chance at that as well, just because I'm further along in my country's development than they are.
So what would you advocate as far as if you're talking about in the developing world or the developed world as far as child labor laws and what would be more ideal? Why don't you lay out a basic framework of what you think a better perspective would be on child labor?
Well, frankly, I first of all, from the standpoint of the United States, the more local, the better. I do not advocate federal intervention. This was handled adequately at the state level up until the early 20th century. There's no reason why it can't go back to that right now. However, let's be honest, even if all federal statutes regarding child labor were abolished, things wouldn't change because everybody at this point agrees that in this country agrees that child labor is horrible and they don't want it, so those laws would still exist. But in theory, I don't agree with child labor laws at all of any kind. I mean, that's something that parents should decide for their children, or their children can decide for themselves. So I wouldn't even go as far as advocating framework. I advocate the complete just removal of all child labor laws, even at the local level.
Now, if in cases where I'm going to ask a few hard questions now. In the cases where a parent is an abusive parent or a neglectful, a permissive parent, somebody who really genuinely does not care about their child, how would you keep a check on those kinds of parents essentially just selling their children off to make money for them?
How would parents? Can you rephrase the question? How would
If you
parents?
have a parent that's just a disreputable person, they don't care about their child. They are envision the modern welfare abuser, but with child labor. So somebody who really doesn't care about their child. Their child is there to make money for them. So they essentially sell off they have children and sell them off as wage earners, essentially. I'm going to have more kids so I can sell them into working. Each kid I have, when they work a full work week, and I get $100 for that, so I'm just going to have more children. how might that, if we have no regulation on child labor, how might that be prevented?
Well, I have a couple thoughts on that. One is wealthy, or maybe not even wealthy, maybe just middle class individuals. If these parents are going to be literally selling their children off, then even if it's just to earn an income for them and not, the removal of the child from the home being completely sold, then there's nothing that stops an individual from basically purchasing that child or hiring them to the point where they're working at this loving person's house, all the time and under better influence. Or better yet, I mean, we see this again, this is maybe a little bit of a side tangent, but people say you shouldn't be able to, women who have children, can only have an abortion or they can only give their children up for adoption. People have this emotional reaction to women selling their babies to people who want them. Well, the problem with that is, people think that, these, I don't know, drug addict women will just continuously have babies and sell them to get money. But the problem is that not many people are going to want to purchase, children who come from drug addict, mothers. So if these children are being raised in these horribly abusive conditions, not many people are going to. I mean, I certainly at my factory wouldn't want wouldn't want a child who comes from an abusive home, and that child's going to have problems socializing. They're going to have problems listening to authority, and so there's not going to be a market for. I believe there wouldn't be a market for those children, to go off and work because they're going to have so many problems socializing and working with others. So while it is possible, I think that occurrence would be so unlikely due to just due to not very many people are going to want to hire those children, and of the people who would, like I said, there shouldn't be anything stopping from somebody hiring or buying that child who would give them a better home life.
Now, when you say buying the child, I'm assuming you don't mean the slave sense where they actually have property ownership of the child, but rather like an adoption that they paid for.
No, that's right. That's right. And this is a topic for another day, but I'm very. Children are not property. I don't care if they're 1 month old or 17 years old. They're not owned by their parents. They're not owned by anybody. So no, they could not be sold into like a slavery situation. And I think that actually, the idea people look at child labor laws as a progressive form of child rights or childhood rights. I actually look at it as the opposite. So, if a 9-year-old wants to intern or work at, let's say, a nearby apiary, the child loves bees, they can't get enough, and the parents, work, I don't know, they don't have their own beehive. If a child wants to spend a few hours a day there and work and learn, to say that child can't earn a living there or earn an income there is actually the opposite of childhood rights or child rights. You're not viewing children as people.
Right, so you're depriving them of choice.
Well, that's right. Choice and autonomy, which are indications of individual personhood.
And as a side note, just briefly, I do find it interesting. It does seem how childhood is viewed upon as this time where you're not supposed to make choices. You're just supposed to kind of do child things. And I think that goes back to what you said about the kind of sanctity of what it means, what childhood even means. And I think that our society has developed a very unhealthy notion of what childhood actually is defined as. It is defined as this kind of ethereal space when you're younger and everything is wonderful and you just run around smiling and laughing. And I don't think that people are putting enough thought into how that happiness is actually fostered in children. I mean, we have so many permissive parents these days where they think that purchasing toys and distractions or allowing unregulated media use from video games and television and that's the way to make your child happy, and just give them as much time and as many resources as possible for them to fill their lives with these very trite, usually insignificant actions and activities. And it's so misguided because that kind of a foundation in childhood essentially makes a dysfunctional adult. I don't see how you can truly appreciate the happiness like you would in that childhood, that those carefree moments when you think back of like this happiness of running around and enjoying yourself. You don't appreciate that as much if you have nothing to overcome. And it seems like I see so many children these days, not that children should be given all this hardship or anything like that, but as a child, I think that you raise them ideally in a method that allows them to see how their actions affect the world around them. And when they're insulated from that, and it's only through easy video games or watching television or buying toys, that seems to be the true child abuse to me. And I think that going back to child labor, if the labor is reasonable, reasonable, and we're not getting into one of these situations where children are being, bartered off to the highest bidder or something like that, in a negative way, then I think that that's perfectly fine. I'd be fine with the relaxation of the child labor laws. You haven't convinced me, though, that corporations would necessarily not want dysfunctional children. I think there's lots of jobs that are so monotonous that it wouldn't really require a higher functioning child.
Well, just first to interrupt real quick, you mentioned about permissive parenting and just buying toys and putting their kids in front of video games or computers. Ironically enough, that is the sign of a developed country. So, there you go. Is that the inevitable outcome of an advanced economy? I don't know, but it's kind of an irony there with that. But what job would exist that a boss, because I think the statistics are clear that children from abused homes do have problems with their peers, they have problems with authority. And when I say authority, I don't mean somebody that just simply tells you what to do, but somebody who is wise and somebody who knows. Like, my dentist can't tell me what to do, but he is an authority over teeth because he studied it. So that kind of authority. What kind of boss would want a child with problems? There could be. I can't think of any. What are you thinking?
Well, you could any kind of something that was very monotonous and did not require a lot of thinking, or just essentially repeat this action, or if picking up garbage, if there was a market for that. Anything that does not require a lot of, this is what you have to do. It's you don't have to do anything intensive as far as intellectually. You don't have to have complex orders followed. You just do this. And there's a lot of dysfunctional children that, they come from dysfunctional backgrounds, let's put it that way. And once you put them into a system like that, they're going to start to learn the rules and what they can and cannot do. And if they get fired, their abusive parent is going to beat them, so they don't want that. So they just follow the rules and within a mild framework and do what they need to get by. And I think that there is room for exploitation there. But I'll interject another comment, just briefly, what you're saying about permissive parenting. I don't think that that's a signature of a developed economy. I think that's a signature of a dysfunctional developed economy, and that gets back to the crucial element that I think that is left out of this equation is that it's been primarily about economics, and we're missing cultural values. I think that a truly developed society will not have an epidemic of permissive parenting because they're going to, if they're truly developed, are going to embrace cultural values that that honestly and truthfully embrace the upcoming generation and try to foster them to be the best that they can, not just to give them whatever they may desire at that moment or time. And that requires greater intellect. It requires a greater degree of scrutiny and thinking and skepticism and continual mental advancement. And this society certainly is not there. And I think that missing element of culture, that is what I would argue would fill in the gaps, or what I see the gap being with your perspective on the possible exploitation. And that is, with the right cultural values and the right community support, I think that you could have systems where children could work and the factories, first of all, you'd have less dysfunctional children if it was a stable system, and the factories saw dysfunctional children in the kind of system that I'm thinking about, the factories would actually have a vested interest to help that child out of that situation. But I don't think that's the world we live in right now.
Right. And think about it like this too. You mentioned culture. When children are shipped off to school, when they're not put in a place of work, or they're not choosing to be in a place of work, or even in the situation of like home education where they can do both education and work if they choose the latter, is that in a situation of school, compulsory school, is that children are in a peer-to-peer environment where they are essentially learn their social cues. They learn culture from their peers rather than their elders. So, if we are to maintain a specific culture, then I would argue we ought to have children around adults more than children are, at least in Western countries, than they are now, because the parents are the bearers, the protectors of culture, and it's not the way human beings, I think, as tribal creatures were originally designed to be, where there would be more adults than children around, and in a school setting now there's 30 kids to one adult, and the children, I mean, it's a Lord of the Flies situation at that point. And it really, that right there can do damage to culture as well.
I agree entirely. And I think that's another big point of child abuse and neglect that goes on in our society is that out of sight, out of mind mentality is, you just shove your kids into this system and assume that they're going to be better off when they come out. In reality, you're just letting peers raise themselves. I mean, let's face it, how significant a role are permissive parents that aren't actively engaged in their children going to be against the public school system? The teachers don't have any control over it. We already know that. So they're being raised by their peers, and the peers, this whole group, they're all being raised essentially by the mainstream media. And it's very, very dangerous. We have children that are now being exposed to concepts and ideas that are far beyond their understanding way too early. Not to say that I'm not in favor of sheltering children at all, but they're not given a context or a framework of logic to work within. They're just kind of exposed to these things in a vague sense with no framework. And that's where true parenting, I think, comes in, is that being actively involved with your children. Something that I hinted that I'm in favor of the system of homesteading, and that system, or even family apprenticing, is when you have a trade, whether it be agriculture or blacksmithing, or it could even be done today very easily. You just have, if there was more small business, it would be very easy to do. When you have a trade, you have children, if you raise them in that trade, you can raise them not only with the work ethic and the family values and the framework for understanding your complex reality, but also you can raise them with such a vastly superior degree of proficiency in their work. I mean, if you imagine the difference between going to a public school and a bunch of people that are burned out and they don't even want to deal with kids anymore for the most part, and then going to college, which has been so watered down at this point that it's almost useless. Compare that to spending all that time apprenticing and working with your family, learning a trade. I mean, you would be an expert by the time you were in your early 20s. And I think that that is, again, one more element when you look at it systemically and you take into account not just child labor, but also the public education system, the kind of falling apart of family. And I'm not speaking necessarily just about conventional families, but the idea of a family unit as being a framework to help bring up the next generation. I think that when you look systemically, there really is a wide spectrum of child abuse that's going on in our society that is, again, out of sight, out of mind.
I think that's right. I couldn't have said it better.
So, wrapping up, do you have any final thoughts, anything you'd like to throw in there that you may not have mentioned?
Well, like I said, I think that the only proper solution, this is sort of more of a summary than anything, but the only proper solution to this is to abolish child labor laws in their entirety. And the problems that may arise from abolishing child labor laws are would be small compared to the problems we see today. And you're talking about culture. Well, culture is people, and people make decisions, not governments, when it comes to this. So, it's I, you know, as a greedy capitalist pig, I would love to see 5-year-olds toil and put together my socks in a garment factory. So anything that would increase my enjoyment, and the the road is paved with children as I run over them in my Rolls Royce. So anything that can accelerate my pleasure out of that. No, of course, but no,
There's some people that'll
absolutely.
probably think you're serious there.
Well, no, absolutely. Just get rid of them. Let parents decide. Let children decide, and the problems that inevitably will occur from that. Like I said, I cannot imagine a scenario in which they would be worse than what we have now.
And that's a good place to put it in perspective as well, is that we have to deal with what we have now as comparison. People like to often compare things to utopian perspectives and get very much lost along the way of what we can do right now to improve the situation. Okay. Well, thank you once again for coming on. You always bring some interesting topics and perspectives. We'll definitely do one of these again. And also, thank you anybody out there for listening. And if you have a counter argument, if you have a better argument you think, put it in the comments. We will take a look. And if you want us to go deeper on this topic, give us a comment. We can always, any of these topics that you find interesting, if you want us to delve deeper, these are all kind of scratching the surface, we can go and do a more in-depth look as well.
And for anybody that was triggered during this conversation, give me a buzz. I know the phone numbers of some world-class therapists.
There's going to be so much triggering on this channel. Give it time. If you like to be triggered, hang around.